Well, 2 years ago, nobody had heard of the coronavirus. Then in January 11th, 2020, China reported its first death by the virus. Now the official count is that there are 240 million coronavirus cases, causing a total of 490,000 deaths. And it has impacted almost every area of life. Millions have lost their jobs. Most of us haven't seen our friends or family or gone to school for the last 3 months. And some of us are struggling with mental health issues as a result. What seems so secure, our lifestyle, our independence, our freedom, our lives, are now so uncertain. And many of us are filled with fear. And it's in these times that people begin to ask, where can we go for security, for a more solid foundation, for hope that can't be shaken? And we see this by what people are searching on the internet. There has been a 170% increase in clicks in search engines about finding hope. And clicks on ads about fear increased 57%, and ads about worry, 39% increase. It's actually, I think, a precious gift from God to discover that the pillars holding up our peace are hollow and made of paper mache. So the question is there a reason to hope in God amidst this pandemic? Amidst all of the difficulties that we face in life? This is the same kind of question Habakkuk was facing, knowing that the Babylonians were coming and were going to lay waste to his city. Well, what we've seen so far is that Habakkuk has been wrestling with God's goodness and his justice. To Habakkuk, it seems like God has hired a worse bully to bring justice on a lesser bully. It's like calling in Hitler's army to punish a few naughty school kids. And we've been challenged with our framework of God, because God has shown us that God is big enough to use even evil for good. So we have learned that the righteous shall live by faith. And in the final chapter, chapter 3, we learn what this kind of faith looks like. And the first thing we learn about it is that faith looks back. Faith looks back. Interestingly, chapter 3 is written as a song to be sung, as it says at the end of chapter 19, of verse 19. And this song begins verse 1 to 2, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet, a prophet being someone who has God's message to bring to God's people, according to Shigionoth, O Lord, I have heard the report of you, and your work, O Lord, do I fear. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Habakkuk has just heard the report of the devastating destruction that Babylon will bring upon his people through Babylon in chapter 1. And now he remembers how God acted on behalf of his people in the past. Habakkuk longs for God's people, God's mercy, where God comes to deliver his people in the midst of years, which just means in the present day, just as he had done for Israel in the past. And he goes on to describe how God appeared in different ways, which is called a theophany, to save Israel in the past. And as he does this, he creates an awesome visual picture of God. After describing how God appeared to the Israelites on Mount Sinai in verses 3 to 4, in lightning and in cloud, he draws a painting of the Exodus. In verse 5 to 15, he paints a picture of God's deliverance of his people from 400 years of crying out to him in slavery through the Exodus. In verse 5, he says, before him went pestilence, and plague followed at his heels, recalling the 10 plagues God sent in judgment upon Egypt. Verse 15 says, you trampled the sea with your horses, the surging of mighty waters. Just as the Egyptians rode their mighty chariots, so too did the Lord. It's as if God rode his own horses in against the Egyptian chariots to close the sea in on the Egyptian army. Israel could never have escaped from Egypt. Only God's intervention saved Israel. And then in verse 11, it says, the sun, the moon stood still in their place at the light of your arrows as they sped, at the flash of your glittering spear. The third painting Habakkuk paints is the picture of God when in Joshua chapter 10, God caused the sun to stop moving in the sky so that Joshua and Israel could win their battle over a people called the Ammonites. On this day, God hurled large hailstones down from the sky. So more of the Ammonites died from the hailstones than were killed by the sword of the Israelites. Collectively, these events paint a picture of God, the divine warrior, fighting for his people. And in this first section, Habakkuk teaches us to remember God's providence in directing all things. Now, there are two dangers when we think about the future. The first is called fatalism, where we look at the world around us and throw our hands in the air and conclude, this is the way things must be. There's no point trying to change things. But Habakkuk cries out that this is not the way things ought to be. When we pray for victims of abuse and ongoing injustice in its various forms, we can join Habakkuk in crying out to God to do something about it. The second danger is thinking that the history of the world is not in God's hands. Many of our friends look at the world and conclude things just happen by chance. And it's easy for us to think, surely God is opposed to the suffering of the innocent. Therefore, if God could stop it, he would. For example, did God want that family member or friend to get cancer or struggle with mental health, as they have been? That God couldn't have done anything about them anyway. And yet God clearly says that he is the one choosing to use the evil Babylonians to destroy Judah, that he does oversee these things. Instead, the Bible teaches what is called God's providence. God's providence is God's governing over all events, both good and bad, for the good of his people, to save them and to make them more like Jesus. God's providence teaches us that whatever I'm going through, God ultimately gave it to me, and because he is a loving God, I can be confident he will work good in through this suffering. Therefore, we can remember our warrior God fights our battles. All of these pictures Habakkuk paints create an awesome visual picture of God as Israel's divine warrior who fights Israel's battles. And he does fight our battles too. Our warrior God fought our greatest battle when he took on human flesh in Jesus. In Revelation chapter 19, verse 11, it says that Jesus is the rider on the white horse, the faithful and true, who judges and makes war. In the New Testament, the death of the Son looks like the victory for evil to the outside observer. But Jesus' death became the spear that unexpectedly defeated our greatest enemy, death. Therefore, we ought to pray, your kingdom come. Habakkuk says, I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. Remember them in our day. And this is the same prayer we Christians pray when we say, your kingdom come. When God will deliver us from sin and death once and for all in his eternal kingdom. And I want to ask you, how often does your faith lead you to praying this prayer, your kingdom come? If we're not praying this prayer, then perhaps we're in danger of forgetting the reason we are a Christian, that our hope is in that future kingdom coming. So faith looks back. And the second thing Habakkuk teaches us about faith is that faith waits in hope. Faith waits in hope. In verse 16, we read, I hear and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. My rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon the people who invade us. Like in verse 2, Habakkuk shares how he responds to what he has heard, and he models a faithful response in 4 stages. Habakkuk does not like what he's heard in chapter 1, and so we see his first response is trembling in verse 16a. The first half of the verse describes Habakkuk's reaction to God's revelation. His heart pounded, his lips quivered, his body went limp, and his legs trembled. Habakkuk knew judgment was coming, and he was filled with a godly fear that helped sharpen his focus on what really matters, getting right with God, which is why he asked for mercy. So response 1, trembling. Response 2, waiting in verse 16b. Because he took his genuine questions to a caring God, Habakkuk began to look at the world from a different perspective. Habakkuk had moved from "how long" to "I will wait patiently." It gave Habakkuk the peace to accept what will come, no matter how long it would take. Wow. Don't we all long for this kind of faith? And then in verse 17 we read, "Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vine, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls." See, here the third response Habakkuk models for us is acceptance. Habakkuk knows that when Babylon invades Judah, they will leave the land desolate, meaning many will starve and die. More significantly, it means they would be under God's curse. Yet, because Habakkuk had found peace and rest in God's plans, he can accept whatever may come. And this leads to his final response, not just acceptance, but rejoicing. What we have seen here is the complete opposite to how we think Habakkuk will respond to the worst economic disaster imaginable. Of all the wonderful passages in the Old Testament, this is one of the greatest expressions of faith. In verse 18 to 19, we read, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread in my high places." His circumstances have not changed. Though he might lose everything in this world, which normally brings life and joy, Habakkuk chooses to place his joy in his God, whom he knows is in control and who he knows can never be taken from him. And this gives Habakkuk strength. Habakkuk's response teaches us three things. Firstly, faith changes people. Faith changes people. In chapter 1, Habakkuk cannot understand why God would do what he's doing, so he challenges God's goodness. But by chapter 3, his attitude changes. He says, "Even if everything in this world is taken from me, so that I have no good thing left to enter, to enjoy, or place my safety in this life, I will rejoice in you." This is a huge transformation. This is the person who lives by faith. And if someone was to look at your life since becoming a Christian or over the last few years, would they have said that you are a changed person? Or do you look the same as you did before, many years ago, or before you were a Christian? So faith changes people. Secondly, faith draws strength from hope. Some of you are probably struggling with depression and anxiety right now. What Habakkuk shows us is that being a Christian doesn't make the feelings of hopelessness, anxiety, and joylessness go away. As we've seen, Habakkuk has physically manifested an anxiety attack. He's literally trembling and quivering as he says these things, right? It's okay to struggle. In difficult times when God's power is not obvious or when we feel weak, we can have hope that God is in control and will do something about it eventually. And this hope can give you strength. This hope is actually meant to be one of the most attractive things about your faith. This is why 1 Peter 3 says, "Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for the reason for the hope that is in you." And I think the coronavirus has given us even more reason for our hope to stand out. At the beginning, I shared how there has been 170% increase in clicks on search engines about finding hope. This could be your friend at school searching as well. Having hope means you will focus your thinking and your conversation beyond your present circumstances to Jesus and his kingdom. And for your school friends who can't help but get down about life, you have an opportunity to talk about your hope with them. So the second thing is faith draws strength from hope. The third thing that we learn about faith is that faith rejoices in all circumstances. You could understand Habakkuk's words as saying, though the coronavirus comes, though our parents might be out of jobs, though many will die, though people for some weird reason will hoard toilet paper, though we couldn't go to school for 3 months, Though I'm struggling with anxiety and depression, nevertheless, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Habakkuk is prepared to live by faith in unseen promises, even in suffering and death. This is, in fact, how the writer of the Hebrews defines faith in Hebrews 11. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Habakkuk looks beyond his circumstances to God as the source of hope and joy, and can never be taken away from him. Habakkuk has every reason not to rejoice. But instead, Habakkuk says, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior." When my wife Pip became a Christian at school, she became a Christian because she met a Christian who was so joyful all the time, and Pip thought she must never have suffered. And then she heard this lady sharing how she became a Christian. She heard how she came to trust Jesus, and she found out that her life was actually really hard, harder than Pip's own life. And her brother struggled with a disability. And actually, trusting Jesus changed her whole life and how she viewed her life. And it was evident her joy didn't come from her circumstances. And Pip actually thought this quality was like a superpower, having joy in difficult circumstances. And this joy led Pip to wanting to know more about Jesus, and as she came to trust in Jesus. And this can be your joy too, if you let God fight your battles for you in Jesus.